Okay, so imagine this. You're in a city, and the police can pretty much arrest anyone they want.
Sounds kind of scary, right?
Yeah, it's wild. Well, it turns out that's exactly what Peter Moskos found when he spent almost 2 years as a Baltimore cop.
Really?
Yeah, in the Eastern District, which is known as one of the toughest parts of the city.
Oh, wow.
So for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at his PhD dissertation, Cop in the Hood.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating read.
Yeah.
He goes through the whole police academy training, patrolled the streets, responded to 911 calls.
So he was really in the thick of it.
Exactly. It wasn't just some academic study. He lived this
Well,
experience.
it's going to give him some serious street cred.
For sure.
Yeah.
And it gives us this incredibly rare insider view, not just of the police work itself,
Right.
but the impact of poverty, the drug trade and violence have on everyone involved.
Both the police and the people they're policing.
So before we get too far, let's set the scene. Paint me a picture of Baltimore's Eastern District. What's it like?
Okay, so picture this high poverty, mostly African-American residents in open-air drug markets operating right out in the open.
Like right on the street corner.
Exactly.
No.
It's a place where the violence rate is through the roof. And this is where Moskos embedded himself, not just observing, but gathering data on police calls, surveying other officers, and recording his own experiences.
Wow, so he was really in the trenches.
Absolutely.
So we've got this setting high poverty, violence, visible drug trade.
Yeah.
What about the drug trade itself? Is it just random people dealing on corners, or is there more to it?
Oh, it's way more organized than you might think. Moskos describes these sophisticated drug shops almost like businesses.
Like they've got a whole system.
Right. They have lookouts, steerers to bring in
Yeah.
customers, money men, slingers who actually handle the drugs, and even gunmen for protection.
Whoa, gunmen.
Yeah. It's a complex operation running completely outside the law.
So it's almost like a parallel society operating right alongside the official one.
You got it.
And I'm guessing that can't be good for the already high violence rate.
Well, you're right. Since these drug shops can't rely on the legal system for things like contracts or protection,
Right.
they often turn to violence to settle disputes, protect their turf, or enforce their own rules.
So they have their own laws and their own enforcement.
Yeah, it creates a really dangerous cycle that traps the whole community.
Now, you would think with all this crime and violence, the police must be constantly responding to 911 calls, right?
Yeah, you'd think so. But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay, listening.
Moskos found that a huge percentage of those 911 calls, over 39%, didn't even require a police response.
Really? So the system is overloaded.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's completely overwhelmed, which forces officers into this reactive mode.
Where they're just constantly putting out fires.
Exactly. They're racing from one call to the next with little time for anything else.
So they're always on the move, but not necessarily in a way that's helping the community or addressing the root causes of the problem.
You hit the nail on the head. And here's another thing. Most officers spend the majority of their time in their patrol cars.
Makes sense. Got to get to those calls fast.
Right. But it also creates this physical and psychological barrier between them and the people they're supposed to be serving.
It's like they're separated from the community.
Yeah, they end up losing touch with the community and the nuances of the problems they're
'Cause
facing.
even though they're there to protect and serve, they're also kind of isolated.
Exactly. And Moskos argues that this car-centric approach to policing can actually make things worse.
Really? How so?
Well, it contributes to that us versus them mentality.
That makes sense. It's hard to build trust and understanding when you're always just driving through rather than walking the streets and talking to people.
Exactly.
Now I got to ask about this whole section in the dissertation where he talks about officers learning to do drugs. I'll be honest, I'm a little confused by what he means by that.
Well, it's almost like there are two sets of rules for policing: the formal rules they learn in the academy, and then the unspoken rules of the street.
So like what they teach you in school versus what you learn on the job.
Exactly. And rookie officers come in with all these ideals,
Right, wanting to make a difference.
but they quickly hit this reality shock when they discover that the job isn't quite what they expected.
So wait, are you saying they're actually being taught how to do drugs?
No, not literally. Of course not. It's more about learning how to identify potential drug offenders, how to spot those telltale signs,
Right.
how to make arrests that will actually stick in court.
So basically learning the tricks of the trade from the other side.
Got it.
So instead of community engagement and problem solving, it's more about arrests and meeting quotas.
It does kind of seem backwards, right? And that's a key point that Moskos makes.
Go on.
The pressure to make arrests, to keep those numbers up, often overshadows the more nuanced, proactive aspects of policing.
It's less about actually solving problems and more about processing people through the system.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing that pressure comes from higher up.
Absolutely. Moskos talks about how officers are often judged based on their arrest numbers.
So it's all about the stats.
And in some cases, they even receive overtime pay for making court appearances.
Wait, they get paid extra for going to court.
Yeah, which creates a financial incentive to make more arrests,
Wow, even for minor offenses.
especially drug-related ones.
So the system is actually encouraging them to make more arrests, even if those arrests aren't actually making the community safer.
It definitely creates a strange incentive structure.
So instead of prioritizing community well-being or focusing on more serious crimes, the system can end up rewarding officers for racking up arrests.
It's like a vicious cycle.
You're focusing on low-level offenses,
Yeah.
filling the courts and jails, but not really addressing the root causes of the problem.
Right, and to illustrate this point, Moskos contrasts two different officers in the book, Officer A and Officer L.
Okay, so tell me about Officer A. What's he like?
Officer A is obsessed with making arrests. He sees it as the core of police work. He's all about the numbers, the game of catching people.
Okay, and what about Officer L? What's his style?
Officer L is more about community relations de-escalation, trying to find solutions that don't always involve putting people in handcuffs.
So he's more of a peacemaker.
Yeah, but he's frustrated because the system seems to reward Officer A's style, while his approach, what he considers good policing, often goes unrecognized.
That's got to be disheartening. To feel like you're doing the right thing, but the system is stacked against you.
It is. It definitely raises questions about what we're actually incentivizing within law enforcement.
Are we rewarding the kind of policing that truly makes communities safer? Or are we just perpetuating this cycle of arrests and incarceration?
Big questions, right?
This whole situation reminds me of something else, something we've seen before in American history.
What's that?
Prohibition.
Ah, yes. And this is where Moskos' work gets really fascinating.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
He argues that the war on drugs is basically Prohibition 2.0.
Hold on, prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
You mean like back in the 1920s when they banned alcohol?
That's the one.
What does that have to do with the drug trade in Baltimore today?
More than you might think, Moskos lays out all these parallels between the two campaigns.
Like what?
Well, they were both fueled by moral panic. This idea that you can simply legislate morality and eliminate a social problem by making it illegal.
So it's about controlling behavior, not necessarily protecting people
Well,
or addressing the underlying issues.
you got it. And we've already seen how that plays out, right?
With prohibition,
Yeah. It didn't eliminate alcohol consumption.
people still wanted to drink.
Exactly. It just pushed it underground, created a massive black market, and empowered organized crime.
Oh, wow. So they traded one problem for a whole bunch of new ones.
And those new problems were arguably much worse. Crime rates skyrocketed during Prohibition.
We're not just talking about petty theft here, right?
No, we're talking about powerful gangs, bootlegging empires, and violence spilling out into the streets.
Sounds kind of like a gangster movie.
It's not that far off. Prohibition created this whole underground industry that thrived on violence because they couldn't rely on the legal system to settle disputes or enforce contracts.
So it's like a shadow justice system.
Exactly. And just like during Prohibition, the people caught in the middle are often the residents of the communities most affected by these policies.
Which in this case is the predominantly black community of the Eastern District.
Right. And this is where those racial disparities we talked about earlier come into play.
How so?
Just as Prohibition was largely enforced in poor immigrant neighborhoods, the war on drugs has disproportionately impacted communities of color.
And Moskos has the stats to back that up, right?
He does.
Yeah.
He cites some pretty startling statistics about the racial disparities in drug arrests and incarceration rates.
It's clear that the burden of the war on drugs is not being shared equally.
And this isn't just about individual prejudice among police officers, although that certainly plays a role in some cases.
Right.
It's also about the systems and policies that drive those outcomes.
You're talking about that unintended law of racial policing concept.
Exactly. Moskos argues that even if every single police officer were completely unbiased, the way we police drug offenses, particularly in high drug areas, would still inevitably lead to racially disparate outcomes.
And those high drug areas are often predominantly black and brown communities.
Unfortunately, yes.
So the system itself is rigged, even if the individuals within it aren't necessarily racist.
That's a powerful way to put it, and it's a really challenging concept for many people to grasp.
Really makes you think.
But it's essential to understand if we want to move towards a more equitable system.
Okay, so let me try to sum this up. We're saying that the war on drugs, just like prohibition before it, has created a massive underground market fueled by violence and corruption, and it's disproportionately impacting communities of color.
That's a great summary.
And this is all happening because we decided to make drugs illegal.
And it's important to remember that Moskos isn't saying that drugs aren't harmful.
Right.
He's questioning whether criminalization as our primary approach is actually the best way to address those harms.
So if the war on drugs is failing, are there any alternatives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thankfully, Moskos points us in a different direction.
I'm all ears.
He argues that we need to shift our focus away from criminalization and towards a harm reduction approach.
Okay, harm reduction.
Yeah.
What does that mean in practice? Give me some specifics.
It means treating drug addiction as a public health issue, not a criminal justice issue.
So like getting people the help they need instead of locking them up?
Exactly. It means investing in treatment and prevention programs.
Instead of just building more prisons.
Right. It means providing resources and support to people who are struggling with addiction rather than just punishing them.
He mentions Portugal, right?
He does.
Weren't they one of the first countries to decriminalize all drugs?
Yes. Back in 2001, Portugal decriminalized all drugs, and the results have been pretty remarkable.
Really? What happened?
They've seen a significant decrease in drug-related deaths, HIV infection rates, and overall drug use.
Wait, so decriminalization actually led to a decrease in drug use?
Yeah.
That seems counterintuitive.
I know, it goes against a lot of what we've been told. But the evidence from Portugal suggests that treating drug addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal issue can lead to better outcomes.
So it's not about condoning drug use. It's about recognizing that addiction is a complex problem that requires a more nuanced and compassionate approach.
Exactly. And Moskos also points out that we need to address the root causes of drug addiction.
Like what?
Things like poverty, lack of opportunity, trauma, mental health issues, these are all factors that contribute to drug use.
So we can't just arrest our way out of this problem.
Nope. We need to invest in solutions that actually get at the underlying social and economic factors.
So trying to put out a fire by just focusing on the flames without addressing the fuel that's feeding it.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the need for a more holistic approach to drug policy.
One that recognizes the interconnectedness of these issues.
Exactly.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. It's making me rethink a lot of my assumptions about the war on drugs.
It's definitely thought-provoking.
But I'm also feeling a little hopeful, like maybe there's a way out of this mess.
I think that's one of the most important takeaways from Moskos' work. He's not just pointing out the problems, he's also offering a vision for a different future, a future where we approach drug addiction with compassion, understanding, and a commitment to evidence-based solutions.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's actually a path forward. But it requires us to change the way we think about this issue.
Absolutely.
To move away from the fear-based judgmental approach
Yeah.
that has dominated the conversation for so long.
You said it.
You know, I'm really struck by the fact that Moskos actually lived this experience. He wasn't just an academic observing from afar. He was out there on the streets interacting with people, seeing the human toll of these policies firsthand. I'd love to hear more about some of those personal stories.
Me too. Those moments that really brought this issue home for him.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to pick up in part 2.
Let's do it. All right, so let's talk more about these prohibition parallels. You're saying it didn't exactly work out as planned?
Yeah, not so much. The idea was if you ban alcohol, people would just stop drinking, problem solved.
Seems a little simplistic looking back, doesn't it?
Yeah, kind of naive. It turns out people like to drink.
And you can't really legislate that away.
Nope. And when you suddenly make something illegal that millions of people enjoy,
You're going to have problems.
right, you get some serious unintended consequences.
So what happened? Did people actually stop drinking?
Well, at first, yeah. Alcohol consumption went down in the first few years of Prohibition.
Okay.
But here's the thing, it didn't last. And maybe more importantly, the social costs were enormous.
What do you mean by social costs?
Think organized crime, rampant violence, widespread corruption. It's like they tried to close one door and 10 more flew open.
So they traded one problem for a whole bunch of new ones.
You got it. And those new problems were arguably much worse. Crime rates skyrocketed during Prohibition.
And we're not talking about petty theft here.
No, we're talking about powerful gangs, bootlegging empires, violence spilling out into the streets.
It's like something out of a gangster movie.
It's really not that far off, actually. Prohibition created this whole underground industry. Wow.
that thrived on violence because they couldn't rely on the legal system to settle disputes or enforce contracts.
So, if we're drawing parallels to the war on drugs, are you saying that we're essentially recreating those same conditions?
That's exactly what Moskos is arguing. He's saying, look, we've already been down this road and it led to a dead end. We can't ignore history.
So, how does this connect to what's happening in Baltimore's Eastern District specifically? I mean, we're not talking about Al Capone and Tommy guns here.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
But the underlying dynamics are similar. Remember those drug shops we talked
Okay,
about?
yeah, the ones with the gunmen.
Right. Well, they operate much like those criminal enterprises during Prohibition.
Really?
Yeah, they have their own hierarchies, their own codes of conduct,
Their own laws?
and their own methods of enforcement, which often involve violence.
So, because they can't go to court to settle a dispute or enforce a contract, they resort to violence. It's like we're back in the Wild West. It is kind of like that. And just like during Prohibition, the people caught in the middle are often the residents of the communities most affected by these policies.
Which in this case is the predominantly black community of the Eastern District.
Right. And this is where those racial disparities we talked about earlier come into play.
How so?
Just as Prohibition was largely enforced in poor immigrant neighborhoods, the war on drugs has disproportionately impacted communities of color.
So it's not just about the drugs themselves, it's about who's being targeted.
Exactly. And Moskos cites some pretty startling statistics about the racial disparities in drug arrests and incarceration rates.
It's clear that the burden of the war on drugs is not being shared equally.
And this isn't just about individual prejudice among police officers, although that certainly plays a role in some cases.
Right.
It's also about the systems and policies that drive those outcomes.
You're talking about that unintended law of racial policing concept.
Exactly. Moskos argues that even if every single police officer were completely unbiased, the way we police drug offenses, particularly in high drug areas, would still inevitably lead to racially disparate outcomes.
Because those high drug areas are often predominantly black and brown communities.
Right. It's like the system itself is rigged, even if the individuals within it aren't necessarily racist.
That's a really powerful point, and it's kind of a hard one to wrap your head around.
It is. It's a challenging concept,
Right.
but it's essential to understand if we want to move towards a more equitable system.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm following you. We're saying that the war on drugs, just like Prohibition before it, has created a massive underground market fueled by violence and corruption, and it's disproportionately impacting communities of color.
That's a great summary. And it's important to remember that Moskos isn't saying that drugs aren't harmful.
Right, of course they can be.
He's questioning whether criminalization as our primary approach is actually the best way to address those harms.
So if the war on drugs is failing, are there any alternatives? What can we do differently?
That's the big question, right? And thankfully, Moskos points us in a different direction.
Okay, I'm listening.
He argues that we need to shift our focus away from criminalization and towards a harm reduction approach.
Harm reduction.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Give me some specifics.
It means treating drug addiction as a public health issue, not a criminal justice issue.
Okay, so getting people help instead of throwing them in jail.
Exactly. It means investing in treatment and prevention programs instead of building more prisons. It means providing resources and support to people struggling with addiction rather than just punishing them.
He talks about Portugal, right?
He does.
Weren't they one of the first countries to decriminalize all drugs?
Yes. Back in 2001, Portugal decriminalized all drugs, and the results have been pretty remarkable.
Really? What happened?
They saw a significant decrease in drug-related deaths, HIV infection rates, and overall drug use.
So decriminalization actually led to a decrease in drug use? That seems counterintuitive.
I know, right? It goes against a lot of what we've been told.
Yeah, for sure.
But the evidence from Portugal suggests that treating drug addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal issue can lead to better outcomes.
So it's not about saying drugs are okay. It's about recognizing that addiction is a complex problem that requires a more nuanced and compassionate approach.
Exactly. And Moskos also points out that we need to address the root causes of drug addiction.
Things like poverty.
Yeah, things like poverty, lack of opportunity, trauma, mental health issues. These are all factors that contribute to drug use.
So we can't just arrest our way out of this problem.
Nope. We need to invest in solutions that actually get at the underlying social and economic factors.
It's like trying to put out a fire by just focusing on the flames without addressing the fuel that's feeding it.
Perfect analogy. And it highlights the need for a more holistic approach to drug policy, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of these issues.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. It's making me rethink a lot of my assumptions about the war on drugs,
Yeah.
but I'm also feeling a little hopeful, like maybe there's a way out of this mess.
I think that's one of the most important takeaways from Moskos' work. He's not just pointing out the problems, he's also offering a vision for a different future.
What kind of future?
A future where we approach drug addiction with compassion, understanding, and a commitment to evidence-based solutions.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's
Yeah.
actually a path forward, but it requires us to change the way we think about this issue, to move away from the fear-based judgmental approach that has dominated the conversation for so long.
Exactly.
You know, I'm really struck by the fact that Moskos actually lived this experience. He wasn't just an academic observing from afar. He was out there on the streets, interacting with people, seeing the human toll of these policies firsthand. I'd love to hear more about some of those personal stories, those moments that really brought this issue home for him.
I think that's a great place to pick up in part 3.
All right, so you mentioned some personal stories from Moskos' time as a Baltimore cop. I'm ready to hear about the human side of all this.
Well, one thing that really struck me was his description of the police academy training. It's like they're learning a whole new language, a whole new way of seeing the world.
Besides learning how to do drugs,
Right. It's more than just tactics. They're being socialized into a particular mindset.
a way of thinking about crime, about their role as police officers.
Exactly.
So what kind of mindset are they being trained to adopt?
It's a mindset that emphasizes control, order, and efficiency. They're taught to see the world in terms of black and white, good guys and bad guys, us versus them.
And how does that translate to their actual work on the streets? Does that mindset help them, or does it actually create more problems?
That's a great question, and it's something that Moskos really grapples with in his research. He talks about this reality shock that many rookie officers experience when they first hit those streets.
Reality shock. What do you mean by that?
Well, they come in with all these ideals,
Right.
wanting to help people make a difference. But then they quickly discover that the reality of the job is much more complicated, much messier.
Than what they were taught in the academy?
Exactly.
So what happens? Do they adapt, or do they burn out?
It's different for everyone, of course. But Moskos observed a pattern of disillusionment and cynicism setting in for many officers as they spent more time on the job.
Makes sense. And I'm guessing this pressure to make arrests, to meet those quotas, plays a role in that disillusionment.
Absolutely. When you're constantly being pushed to produce numbers, it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture, the human impact of your actions.
He talks about how officers start to dehumanize the people they're interacting with, particularly drug addicts.
Right.
Like they have to create this emotional distance.
Yeah, it's a defense mechanism, a way to protect themselves from the emotional burden of constantly dealing with poverty, addiction, and violence. But it also makes it easier to justify the cycle of arrests and incarceration.
Even if it's not actually making the community any safer.
Exactly.
So they're stuck in this system that's pushing them to focus on arrests, even if they know deep down that it's not really solving the problem.
And that's got to take a toll on their own mental health, too.
He describes one scene that really stuck with me. He and his partner are responding to a call about drug dealing, and they end up chasing this suspect through a vacant building.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
And as they're searching for the guy, they come across this group of young kids huddled together in a corner, absolutely terrified. And it just hits Moskos in that moment.
The human.
It's a powerful moment because it really highlights those unintended consequences. We often focus on the harms of the drugs themselves,
Right.
but we forget about the ripple effects, the impact on families, on communities, on those innocent bystanders.
Those kids didn't choose to be born into that environment, to be surrounded by poverty and violence.
And yet they're often the ones who are paying the price for our failed policies.
And it's not just the kids. It's the parents who are struggling with addiction, the families that are being torn apart, the entire community that's living under this constant shadow of the drug trade and police presence.
It makes you realize that this isn't just some abstract policy debate. It's about real people's lives.
And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from Moskos' work. He's not just presenting data and statistics.
Right.
He's giving us a glimpse into the human faces behind those numbers. He's reminding us that there are real people caught in the crossfire of this war, and their stories deserve to be heard.
It's a powerful reminder that policies have consequences.
Absolutely.
And those consequences are often felt most acutely by the most vulnerable members of our society.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to break this cycle?
Well, Moskos doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does provide some valuable insights. He argues that we need to shift our approach away from punishment and towards treatment.
Treat addiction as a health issue.
Exactly, not a moral failing.
He talks about Portugal,
Right?
where they decriminalized all drugs and saw a decrease in drug-related deaths and HIV infections. It's a radical idea, but it seems to be working.
It is radical. It challenges a lot of our preconceived notions about how to deal with drug addiction. But the evidence from Portugal suggests that a more compassionate, public health-oriented approach can be more effective.
He also emphasizes the importance of addressing the root causes of addiction. Poverty, lack of opportunity, trauma, mental health issues. We can't just arrest our way out of this problem. We need to invest in solutions that create healthier, more supportive communities.
And that requires a fundamental shift in how we think about addiction, how we talk about it, and how we respond to it.
Moving away from that fear-based, judgmental approach.
Exactly, the one that has dominated the war on drugs for so long.
It's about recognizing that people who use drugs are not criminals. They're human beings who need our help.
Not our condemnation.
Moskos ends his dissertation with a powerful quote from August Vollmer, who was a police chief and sociologist back in the 1930s. Vollmer said that drug addiction is not a police problem. It never has been and never can be solved by policemen.
Wow, that's a profound statement.
Hmm.
And it really gets to the heart of the issue. We can't simply arrest our way out of this problem. We need a different approach, one that's grounded in compassion, understanding, and a commitment to addressing the root causes of addiction.
So what does this all mean for us as individuals, as a society? What can we do to make a difference?
Well, I think the first step is to educate ourselves and others, to challenge the myths and misconceptions that surround drug addiction, to have open and honest conversations with our friends and family, to support organizations that are working on the front lines of this issue.
We can also contact our elected officials, advocate for policy changes, and vote for candidates who support a more humane and effective approach to drug policy.
Exactly. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with each of us taking responsibility, speaking out, and demanding better. This deep dive has been a journey into a dark corner of our society, but it's also a reminder that we have the power to bring light to those shadows, to change the narrative, and to create a more just and compassionate world.
It's a heavy topic, but it's one that we can't afford to ignore. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.